So dear all, first of all, and on behalf of all co-authors involved in this communication, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, as well as all those who contribute to make it possible. The projects we are representing, the Dadan Archaeological Project, the Madain Saleh Archaeological Project, the Mudud Project in the Old Town, in the Old Town of AlUla, the Kur Conservation and Archaeological Project, the UCOP Survey Project, and the Kur Plain Survey Project all work in the same region, AlUla, in northwestern Arabia. As the call for papers came out, and since many of our projects are chronologically overlapping, we decided to go beyond the limits of each of them, setting the region and not each single project at the heart of our study. The AlUla region, through its location and its history, is frequently mentioned as a crossroad, a resting and trading place since antiquity. While this is well attested by written accounts of several periods, what do artifacts reveal about this position? Through them, which networks can be retraced, and what do they reveal, or not, about the participation of AlUla into regional and international networks? Was the oasis only a resting place or also a place to exchange goods? And how did this may have changed throughout time? To address these issues, we decided to focus on imported pottery vessels. Our dataset encompassing a pottery record spanning the early 2nd millennium BCE to the present day, we aim at presenting the state of the art on imported pottery vessels on the longue-durée, identifying regions of origin and imported quantities to investigate the exchange networks AlUla was part of, as well as their evolution through roughly 4,000 years. In this communication, the identification of imports is primarily based on visual comparisons with groups of pottery whose site or region of production is well known. Within each involved project, these groups were also quantified. Even though the quantification methods are differing, since depending on the general methodological framework of each project, the numbers presented are at least a rough estimate of the quantities involved, enabling us to point out possible changes and continuities in the volume of imported goods. The earliest group of imported pottery identified at this day is known as red burnished ware or barbotine ware. While this group is known at its places of production, Taima and Kuraya, to also have included plain vessels, the exclusive presence of decorated items in the AlUla region suggests that this decoration was likely the reason for importing the vessels. As you can see on the maps on the right, most occurrences are located at Dadan. Here. While important concentrations of local contemporary pottery were found through most parts of the core area and in the old town, so in these parts of the AlUla region. Although this might suggest that only Dadan and not the whole area of AlUla profited of potential exchange networks, one should also keep in mind that research on this period in the region just started a couple of years ago, and thus that the available data may not be representative. Nonetheless, these shards attest of the existence of a regional network in northwestern Arabia, which connected at least the oases of Kuraya, Taima, and AlUla to each other. The small amounts of recorded shards, only 10, suggests, however, that the trade of pottery, even though possible, was not a major economic activity in the early 2nd millennium BC. The remaining part of the 2nd millennium is clearly characterized by the massive presence of painted pottery referred to as Kuraya painted ware. Most of the groups recently identified at Kuraya as concealed behind this generic label and dating between the 17th and the 10th centuries BCE are attested in the AlUla region. For the 12th to 10th century BCE, there is a further shard to be mentioned, which, even though not spectacular, it's only the base of a cylindrical beaker, is noticeable since it's the first attestation of the Taima early Iron Age ware outside of Taima. If the concentration of imported pottery at Dadan seems to be in the continuity of the early 2nd millennium BCE, There is, however, a clear quantitative change with over 900 shards recorded, even though this number also include here non-diagnostic body shards. This quantity suggests that the vessels were relatively common and their presence likely related to specific cultural practices rather than to their economic value. Pending archaeometric analysis, it might not be possible to state whether the AlUla occurrences of Kuraya painted ware originated from Taima or Kuraya. However, they evidence the continuity of a regional network throughout the 2nd millennium BC, connecting together these three oases. At the same time, the involved numbers suggest tidier contacts between them, especially with common cultural practices. The scarcity of the data available for the first half of the 1st millennium BCE stands in stark contrast to the previous period. Here, we have only 3 single imported painted shards to be identified, all likely originating from Taima and ascribed to the so-called Sanaye painted ware. However, their low number really prevents further considerations on their distribution. At a first glance, this number suggests a weakening of extant networks in northwestern Arabia. However, we also know from Assyrian and Babylonian written accounts that the trans-Arabian trade was flourishing during this period, possibly correlated with an increasing concurrence between the major oases of the region. Such a competition might be an explanation for the scarcity of regional imports and for the development of a local group of painted pottery, while also suggesting that pottery vessels were not among the goods involved in trans-Arabian trade. But what about imported plain pottery? Unfortunately, it's not possible at this day to provide a sound and detailed chronology of this plain pottery of northwestern Arabia. A relatively important number of such vessels could be identified in AlUla as not being of local origin on the basis of their fabric. However, most of them cannot be dated more precisely than to the 1st millennium BCE or even to the very early 1st millennium CE on the basis of comparisons with Taima. So, furthermore, this kind of fabric is not specific only to Taima, but similar fabrics have been identified also at Kuraya and Dumat al-Jandal, so it's not sure at the moment where these vessels are coming from. The morphological diversity of this group of vessels is noteworthy. On the one hand, it includes closed or closable vessels, which may be testimonies of trading their contents rather than the containers themselves. However, the own weight of these vessels, especially of large storage jars, as we have fragments of them, here on the top, their weight is just questioning whether or why should they be imported to AlUla. Furthermore, the presence of numerous open vessels, especially bowls, is hard to fit into a commercial scheme and suggests that their presence might be related to a specific yet unidentified cultural practice. The quantity of occurrences with over 300 fragments ascribed to this group may provide a counterweight to the preceding hypothesis of increasing competition between the main northwestern Arabian oases. On the other hand, the unclear chronology of this group prevents excluding this possibility as well. In any case, these vessels clearly evidence the perpetuation of regional networks. Between the 5th and 2nd centuries BCE, a large variety of imported vessels has been identified. Flasks assumed to originate from the southern Levant, Attic or Atticizing black gloss pottery, likely from the Aegean, just like also Rhodian amphorae, and Egyptian glazed vessels. The spatial distribution of these imports evidences that the items one could assume to be the rarest and the most valuable, the black gloss pottery and the glazed Egyptian vessels, are, with very few exceptions, concentrated at Dedan and its direct surroundings. So, here. Rhodian amphorae, in contrast, are mainly concentrated at Hegra suggesting the sites fulfill different functions. As to the lentoid flasks, with a huge number of over 3,000 fragments, including body shots for those, as well as their distribution, which is common in all the region between Hegra and the core of the AlUla oasis, suggests they were a relative common commodity, the use of which was not reserved to a few people, in contrast to the other categories of imported vessels. During this period, items originating from beyond northwestern Arabia became available in the AlUla region for the first time. The quantities recorded suggest that the southern Levant became a major commercial partner for AlUla and raise the question whether items from more distant origin may not be indirect imports. It means vessels imported from abroad to the southern Levant and then re-exported to AlUla. Between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century CE, the diversity of imported vessels is still high, with Nabatean fineware, both plain and painted, as well as Western Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, and Mesopotamian consumption vessels. Imported transport and storage vessels, such as amphorae, became apparently rare, even though these might be to the impossibility to identify them among the body shots. Nonetheless, the distribution of the imported vessels reflects a major change in the spatial organization of the region, with a clear shift from Dedan to Hegra, where most of the Nabatean imports were identified and a Nabatean colony established. The surprising quantitative decrease in imported vessels during the most flourishing period of the incense route may be correlated to the development of a local production strongly influenced by the pottery production of the Nabatean core region and possibly replacing imports. Moreover, the number of imported plain vessels, amphora for example, may be underrepresented since plain fragments might not have been identified among the body shards. When considering the regions of origin and the respective quantities of imported vessels, it is obvious that the southern Levant remains the main commercial partner for AlUla, and, as in the previous period, vessels originating from more distant areas of the Mediterranean may represent indirect imports. In contrast, and as suggested by their numbers, imports from southern Mesopotamia and the Gulf region may represent direct imports and attest a slight diversification of the networks people from AlUla could take part in. In the following period, spanning the 2nd to the 4th century CE, as you can see, only very little imported pottery is known at this day, and exclusively present at Hegra. There, it is also noticeable that most of the imported vessels were related to a Roman military camp. The rarity of imported vessels may reflect a reorganization of the trans-Arabian trade rather than its collapse. In this perspective, the sites of the AlUla region may not have been used as trading place anymore, like in the 1st millennium BCE, but their function possibly restricted to a watering and resting place. The imported vessel from Hegra being mainly related to the Roman military camp, it is little surprising to observe that these vessels also originated from the Roman world, in this case, especially from northwestern Africa and the Aegean. For the 5th to 7th centuries, as no stratified material is known, neither local nor imported, it is difficult to identify this period in the survey collections. However, the recent discovery of a late antique area in Dadan should soon provide new insight into this period and possibly also in the preceding one.
So, moving to the Islamic period, so the following period from the 8th to the 9th century is also poorly known in the region, and so are also possible imports. Only few different groups are clearly related to this period, and they correspond primarily to decorated vessels. Moreover, at least in the case of the opaque white glazed and the eggshell wares, their production was not restricted to this period, but started during this period. The pertaining items illustrated here may thus date as well to the following period. Considering the area where these shirts have been collected, it's not noteworthy that they originate from the outskirts of Qurh. When looking at the origin of these few imports, all seem to have been imported from Iraq. However, the general scarcity of data for this period, as well as the imprecision of the suggested dating, prevent drawing further conclusions on the networks the AlUla region may have been connected. For the period spanning the 9th to 11th century, a great variety of imports, mostly glazed materials, could be identified. The importance of such vessels suggests that those may have been mainly imported for their own value and/or the cultural practices related to them, and not for their content. Their distribution mirrors a new spatial organization. Qurh al-Mabiyat is now the main center of the region, while virtually no important pottery was identified north of the Dan. However, numerous fragments of imported vessels found at Dadan and in the core area of the oasis suggest that, despite this shift to the south, not a single site, but large areas were granted access to valuable items of distant origin, either directly or, more likely, through Qurh. Surprising, however, is extreme rarity of imported vessels in the Old Town, especially when considering the numbers of imported vessels found in the gardens in front of it. The origin of imported vessels clearly displays that AlUla was taking part into a network oriented primarily towards Iraq and, to a lesser extent, towards Syria. This means towards the political and economic center of the ruling Abbasid dynasty. However, connections to Egypt seem to have been almost as important as those to Iraq. A new extension of the networks AlUla was connected to is evidenced through the presence of a few Chinese imports, probably reflecting the development at a global scale of commercial ties between China and the Abbasid Empire. After the 12th century and the abandonment of Qurh, a remarkable decrease in the amount and variety of imported materials can be observed. While a restricted range of glazed vessels was likely imported, as in the preceding period, for the value of the vessels, the presence and especially the large amount of molded flasks suggest that their presence may be primarily related to traveling. The distribution of the vessels ascribed to this period suggests that glazed vessels were restricted to the core area of the historical oasis, while flasks would have been mainly restricted to the south area, close to the city of Qurh. However, this distribution might be primarily related to difficulties at identifying and dating precisely imports of this period due to the absence of stratified materials in the region. Consequently, it is uncertain whether this map, featuring the weight of each region from which important vessels were identified, is very accurate. Pending further investigation, especially excavations, and a better understanding of the local and non-local pottery in the period, the network to which AlUla may have belonged between the 12th and the 15th centuries should further be considered as uncertain. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, most of the important vessels are small, open shapes, and feature a blue and white decoration. Among them, two groups can be clearly distinguished: Chinese porcelain, including the so-called Batavian ware, produced exclusively for export, and Anatolian productions. The distribution of these vessels is remarkable, since restricted to the core area of the historical oasis. This suggests a new shift of the center of gravity in the region towards the historical oasis and the Old Town. However, Qurh having already been abandoned in the 12th century, and considering the scanty data available for the 12th to 15th century at least, this shift may as well have taken place earlier. Like in the 9th to the 11th centuries, the virtual absence of imported vessels in the AlUla Old Town is noteworthy. However, the question must remain open whether this was an actual difference between the Old Town and the gardens in front of it, or whether limited numbers of soundings in the Old Town, characterized by a heavily disturbed stratigraphy, can have biased our dataset. One can point out that at this period, vessels from China and Anatolia are equally represented. Both groups of pottery are known to have been highly appreciated by elite in the Ottoman Empire. It is thus tempting to link the presence of these imports at AlUla with an Ottoman elite. Moreover, like the preceding period, the poor knowledge of the pottery of this period in the AlUla region likely biases our results, overrepresenting valuable items while likely underrepresenting common vessels, possibly imported for their content or other reasons. The absence of vessels clearly identified as originating from closer regions such as Egypt, the Levant, Syria, or Iraq seem to confirm the presence of such bias. For the period spanning the 18th century to the present day, the identified imports are mainly decorated porcelain vessels. Among identified imports, two main groups can be distinguished: a polychrome version of Kütahya wares, dating especially to the 18th, 19th centuries, and porcelain vessels, mainly of the late 19th century, to the present day. Among later group, most of the identified vessels are the so-called finjan or qahwa cups, related to a specific cultural practice, drinking Arabic coffee. The distribution of the fragments of this period mirrors the urban and agrarian development of the region. Their largest concentration is found in the Old Town and the core of the historical oasis. The shards identified in the north area between Hegra and Dadan correspond almost exclusively to fragments of modern qahwa cups. Their presence and age is related to the development of the agriculture area in the last 50 years, while their number and their low price clearly attest that these imports are not luxury goods reserved to an elite, but a common and popular commodity. Independently of fine chronological divisions, the collected data evidences a major shift in the orientation of the networks AlUla is practicing in, now primarily headed to Eastern Asia and thus reflecting the globalization of exchange in the contemporary world. The communication provides first diachronic and quantitative study of imported vessels in the AlUla from the 2nd millennium BC to present day. Obviously, it has clear limitations such as the lack of detailed considerations or heterogeneous selection and counting methods. To reconstruct the extent and development of network, the focus on pottery may also be seen as problematic, since trade was not focusing on this commodity, but rather on fragrances and spices, on organic goods, as attested by several ancient written sources. Nonetheless, this overview represents a step towards a comprehensive understanding of material exchange in the AlUla region. Taking in the longue durée, it evidenced successive extensions of the networks AlUla was part of. It started at the scale of northwestern Arabia. Then it extended to the southern Levant, to the eastern and western Mediterranean, to Mesopotamia, Syria, and Iraq. Eventually, it became part of a globalized world. It could also be evidence that this development was not linear, neither in extent nor in intensity. Moreover, the approach at the scale of the region of AlUla enabled us to better understand its spatial organization, to point out shifts in the importance of each site, becoming better visible than in an approach which have focused on a single site. Eventually, the geographic origin of the identified imports discussed in this presentation also draws attention to the absence of imported vessels from regions such as Saudi Arabia and India, although trans-Arabian trade started there. To conclude this talk, we would like to thank all our co-authors, those present in the room here, and those who could not join us today, as well as the projects and the institutions involved. Finally, we would like to express our gratitude to Gaël Gouret and Anne Lechalier-Delaille from Archaïos, who provided the distribution maps in the AlUla region on a very short notice. Thank you.